Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Und ist ein Kindlein, heut geborn, which translates to a little child was born to us today. Fairly straightforward chorale. There is a little interesting chord right here in the second system that I'm going to talk about. It's not, particularly exceptional in terms of its qualities. This chorale is fairly straightforward, but I think it's just kind of interesting the way that it sort of manifested itself into the texture, and I'm going to talk about that when I get to it, but we're just going to hop right into the analysis. So we have one sharp in the key signature, we start on G major, we end on G major. I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is G major. However, interestingly, we do see a perfect authentic cadence in the key of C major at the end of our first phrase. So after our tonic triad, we get another tonic triad, G, D, G, and B, passing tone here in the melody, and then we get F sharp, D, A, and D, which is our 5 chord in first inversion, D major, and then we get G major again, G, D, G, and B, another tonic triad, root position. We then get E, C, G, and G. I reckon this D is a 7/6 suspension over the bass, and really this is a 4 chord in first inversion, which makes sense narratively speaking, because even though you could analyze this as E minor 7 in root position, which would be like a 6/7 chord in the key of G, that would then turn into a 3/7 chord in the key of C. I think the 4 chord makes a little bit more sense just because I feel like it's just operating as our tonic now in the key of C major. But either way, 3/7 versus 1/6, they're virtually the same chords, so there's some ambiguity here, as well as with all the other chords that sort of morph because of one voice due to a suspension or just there being a step between a voice that shares multiple notes in common with the chord, and typically they're a third apart, so 1 versus 3, for instance. We then have this is our 4 chord. We have F, C, F, and A, F major, passing 7th in the bass, and then we get G, G, D, and B, which is our 5 chord, G major, and then we cadence on C major, C, G, E, and C, tonic triad, root position. Next phrase takes us back to the key of G major pretty much at the very beginning. We start off with a G major chord, G, G, D, and B, which is our 5 chord in the key of C, and it also happens to be our tonic in the key of G. This is a bit of a modulation zone, so you can analyze this however you see fit. You could analyze it as C being our common chord, so 4 in the key of G, and then we're already in the key of G. You could analyze this G chord as 5 in the key of C and our tonic in the key of G. It really is a bit of a ambiguous zone, I guess. I've been calling them modulation zones, but I usually say that the modulation happens near or at the end of the zone, because if the chords are diatonic to both keys, what makes one chord any more like the previous key than it does the key that you're modulating to? And this is also a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major as well. So we have D, F sharp, D, and A, which is our 5 chord, a little passing 7th here as well in the alto. Then we have E, G, B, and G, which is our 6 chord, E minor in root position, passing 7th in the bass, and then we get C, C, E, and G, which is our 4 chord. Another thirds bass progression. We've been seeing a lot of these recently in the chorales. Typically chords that are a third apart are probably the least common progressions we see in Bach. When we do see them, they're usually going down, so 6 going to 4, for instance, or 1 going to 6. That's probably the most common one, but usually in between 2 chords that are a third apart, you're going to see a buffer tone, or in many cases a buffer chord, so a chord that is either subdivided as something that's implied or something that's fully voiced. So I guess technically speaking, when we move the bass here, we have D, G, B, and G, which does give us like a second inversion tonic triad in a sense, which would, I guess, narratively make more sense going into 4. But yeah, I think when only one voice is moving, it's hard to justify it as a chord progression and more of just like the chord morphing from one to the other. But yeah, when you have two chords that are a third apart, look for that buffer tone there. I find that the majority of them have some type of barrier in between the two of them to separate them pitch-wise, because they share more tones in common than they don't. But after this passing tone in the bass, the chord just gets inverted. We have E, C, E, and G, which is oh my goodness, sorry, I thought we were still in the key of C major for a second. We have first inversion, and then we get some passing tones in the outer voices, F sharp, C, E, and A, which is F sharp minor 7 flat 5, which is a 7/7 chord. We would expect that to go to 1, G, B, D, and B. Root position, tonic triad, passing tone in the tenor as well. The chord gets inverted, B, G, D, and B. First inversion, no need to reiterate the Roman numeral. Passing tone in the bass, D, G, D, and A. I think this G is operating as a 4/3 suspension over the bass, and this is just a D major chord. Something that Bach often does is he has a suspension, and it often gets reiterated or echoed in another voice with this sort of neighbor tone figure or passing tone figure. Most of the time I think it's a neighbor tone figure, as I'm like quickly indexing all of the times I've seen it recently. But yeah, you'll see it. You'll see the suspension, and then you'll see this little repetition of the suspension in one of the other voices. But we get the resolution on the next beat. No need to reanalyze. A little delayed passing seventh in the alto, and then we cadence on G major, G, D, B, and G. Tonic triad, root position. Okay, next phrase, a little bit interesting here. I think it's an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of D major, just because C sharp plays a role basically like from the halfway point onwards. However, I think there's an argument to be made that this is a half cadence. This really does feel like this A wants to resolve back down to G the more that I listen to the phrase, but analytically speaking, it makes so much more sense in the key of D major that it's hard to ignore, and this A very easily could just resolve up to D anyways, even though we're not going to continue in the key of D beyond this point. So we start off with another G major chord, G, D, G, and B. I'm going to reiterate the Roman numeral because it is a new line, even though when I see the same Roman numeral in repeated situations on the same line, I'll omit them. In this case, because there's a line break, it feels kind of awkward to leave the blank space, so I reiterate the Roman numeral. That takes us to 5, D, D, F sharp, and A. Passing seventh in the tenor, and then we get a chromatic bass line here. Probably really the only big takeaway from this chorale set there is chromaticism in the bass. D sharp, B, F sharp, and B, which is B major over D sharp. That is the dominant of E, which is our 6 in the key of G major, and that takes us to our 6th chord, E, B, E, and G. So it resolves the way we would expect, and seeing C sharp on the next beat, probably the modulations happening here. E minor is now our 2 chord in the key of D. We then have A, C sharp, and E, which is our 5 chord. Passing 7th in the bass, F sharp, A, D, and F sharp. There's our tonic triad in first inversion. We then get a pattern that we see quite a bit in the chorales. We have E, G, C sharp, and G. This D is probably a 7/6 suspension over the bass. This is C sharp diminished over E, which is a 7/6 chord. And when we see 1/6 going to 7/6, it's very common for us to see a root position tonic triad afterwards. D, F sharp, D, and A. This pattern is super common in the chorales, both this way and the retrograde, and just really just preserving this like diatonic relationship as well, where we have 2 similar chords, and the chord that bridges them is a diatonic step below the outside chords in first and it's in first inversion a lot of the time, and we see variations on that, but this is a very staple chord progression. But moving ahead to the last phrase, we move back to the key of G major after we get a brief visitation to E minor, but we spend the majority of this phrase in the key of G major. So I do think we have a direct modulation to E minor here. Main reason why is because we have D versus D sharp separated by the end of a phrase. I mean, you could make an argument that this is still in the key of D major and we modulate over the E minor chord, but this feels like its own separate idea because it's at the start of a phrase. We've had a cadence, new idea, and that plays a big role in terms of determining whether or not a cadence has occurred. So B major here is operating as our 5 chord, and that takes us to E minor, E, G, B, and G. Little neighboring 7th here in the bass before we go to E minor, not E minor, C major in first inversion, E, C, E, and G. And I think at this point, this 6-6 chord is probably our gateway back to the key of G major. It's now our 4-6 chord, and something about that I haven't talked about in a while, but something that was a very common theme in videos past is about 4-6 going to 1, G, B, D, and G. When we see 4-6 going to 1 in this ascending bass configuration, so we have the 6th of the scale in the bass going to the 1, the tonic in the bass, there's only been one chorale that I've seen that's had this progression that has not had a leading tone connecting the 6 and the 1. There's always at least a leading tone. Sometimes it's actually quite common for us to get a fully voiced 7 chord here, so F sharp diminished, or maybe some type of D major chord as well in first inversion. It's very common to see a 7 chord, but bare minimum we'll get this passing leading tone here between the two voices, and this is no exception. This is just following this stylistic thing I've noticed in Bach's writing. But after our tonic, we have some neighbor tones in the lower voices before we get G, B, E, and G. That's E minor in first inversion, so 6-6. And then we get this interesting chord that I've talked about at the beginning of the video. We have F sharp, A, F sharp, and A. First thing that's interesting, typically when we have 4 voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm, there is some type of subdivided chord progression. This is true pretty much for every case, but this provides kind of a unique situation because A, it's not a fully voiced chord. The majority of the time we see all of the voices, all of the chord tones present, and 2, this presents kind of a unique chord progression that's similar to the one that happens at the end of our previous phrase. So if we look at what happens on the downbeat of the next measure, we have E, G, G, and B, which is our 6th chord in root position, which leaves us room to speculate about what's happening here. So I think, based on my experience with the chords that would typically happen in a situation like this, I would think that maybe this is a 5-6 chord. But you might be thinking, Forrest, there's no D in this chord. How can this be a 5-6 chord? Well, for starters, rootless triads are not completely foreign to Bach. We do see them used, or at least implied, in certain cases. They are rare for sure. You don't see them a lot, but they do happen with, you know, a little bit of frequency. We've seen them from time to time. Sometimes they are just a handy way of trying to explain what's going on harmonically, especially in a contrapuntal situation. But here, when we have 2 similar triads, 6-6 and 6, right, 1-6 and 1, separating them by a chord in first inversion makes sense. It just so happens that instead of having a D in any of the voices, we just have the 3rd and the 5th of the chord. Of course, the alternative to this would be saying that this is a 7 chord in root position, but the reason why I think that that's kind of a unlikely situation is because the leading tone is doubled. Now, we have seen the leading tone doubled before in 7 chords in Bach, and coincidentally they do happen typically in subdivided contexts. You probably won't encounter one on the harmonic rhythm on a numbered beat, but on the and of a beat, it has happened once or twice, so exceptionally rare, you know, considering we've analyzed, you know, almost 400 chorales. This is kind of a unique case, and when 4 voices move off of the harmonic rhythm, I'm convinced that even though the chord is incomplete, because typically I only analyze chords off of the harmonic rhythm if they are complete, meaning that all the voices are present to spell the triad, no incomplete triads. It makes me feel like this is a rootless 5 chord, which is really the second big takeaway is the fact that there might be a rootless triad here, and the fact that it's happening off the harmonic rhythm makes sense too. And I have to double check with the score here to see whether or not this printed correctly, and this is in fact just 2 pairs of F sharp and A, one in the lower voices and one in the upper voices. So who knows, maybe it is just incidental and I'm just overthinking this, but I think it is kind of interesting that there is a potential rootless triad going on in the texture here. Regardless, 6 takes us to 1. B, G, D, and B. 1 in first inversion. I was talking about thirds bass progression. 6 and 1 are probably the most common chords that are a third apart to be seen in a progression. And usually, if there is a chord progression that takes us in an ascending fashion, that's a third apart. It usually is 6 going to 1. But yeah, the majority of the time they do go down, like 6 going to 4, for instance. But we do have a passing tone here in the bass that takes us to another cadence very similar to the one that, actually, it's basically identical to the one here in the A section. At the end of the A section, we have D, G, D, and A. This G is a 4/3 suspension over the bass, and it gets echoed here in the melody before we get D, F sharp, D, and A. That's the resolution, so we don't need to reanalyze. Little delayed passing 7th here before we get our tonic triad in root position. And that is today's analysis. Fairly straightforward chorale, a couple of interesting quirks here and there, and definitely some room for interpretation, as is the case with most chorales. Pretty much every single chorale leaves at least one case where there's room for interpretation. But yeah, the big takeaways from this chorale are the chromatic bass line. That's something that I've been keeping track of, is how Bach uses chromaticism in his bass lines to create what harmonic devices he uses outside of the key. And I find that the bass is usually probably the most interesting voice to see chromatic stepwise movement in it. Sometimes we see it in other voices, but most of the time it's in the bass. And the second thing is the potential rootless triad going on here on the and of the last beat in this measure in the B section. What's going on here, I've talked about it at length in this video. Who knows? It's largely up for debate, but I'm pretty convinced that with my research, it is a rootless 5/6 chord, which is pretty cool. But I'm going to cap the video off on those thoughts. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You could also hit the notification icon and like the video as well if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video, and thank you so much for supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.